Can you listen to me in the back? Is it fine?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. I first, of course, want to start by thanking the organizers of the event, Professor Sukyung Woo and Professor Ignacio Lopez Calvo, for the kind invitation. I am positively sought toward gatherings like this. The Caribbean Philosophical Organization also began sort of anti the American Philosophical Association in similar spirit, sort of opening spaces for rigorous and debate and conversations about areas that, if you do them in the larger conferences, there will always be sort of, marginalized to the very early morning panels or the last day afternoon panels and things like that, and also only minimal spaces. And also it's a setup in those spaces as if one is looking for recognition from a system of knowledge that already exists, where in many cases one is sort of, at least in this kind of spaces, challenging those very parameters that are used in those spaces. So it's sometimes much more freeing and productive to do other kind of events, more focused, more concentrated, with less people, to advance these kind of ideas. So in that sense, I felt at home, and the organization has been exemplary, so I thank the entire team for that. I have some thoughts I'm going to share with you today about this notion of the decolonial turn, and I'll be showing some slides here toward the end. I want to begin by saying that a couple of weeks ago, I was one of those academics in Lima, Peru, involved in this massive conference that it was LASA. I don't go to LASA too much. In this case, they invited me to a presidential session on Latin American political philosophy, and Latin American political thought. And I found the description very compelling, and also the setup and the co-panelists ideal kind of companions to reflect about the issues that were featured in the session. So I decided to join them, and in that sense I had a great time with them. It's sort of the spaces that you can sometimes make a great experience in spite of the negative aspects that are going on. So in that sense it was productive in several ways. So I wanted to bring a little bit of that, of the setup from that panel, as it were, because I think it provides a particular lens. Also, in a way, I thought that it was interesting how the big professional association, the Latin American Studies Association, LASA, was sort of formulating the issues, convening a number of academic scholars to think about contemporary political thought. And I thought that I would begin here in conversation with that setup. So I'm going to read the title of the panel and the several sentences that describe it. So it was a presidential session on Latin American political thought, contributions, challenges, and new directions. And this is the description. The purpose of this presidential session is to consider the insights that have emerged from Latin American philosophy and the contributions of Latin American thinkers to contemporary debates. While many 19th and 20th century Latin American thinkers worried about whether the region was merely copying or adopting philosophical ideas produced elsewhere, the end of the 20th century saw the emergence of a decolonial perspective that challenged the continued Eurocentrism of much of the intellectual production in the region since independence and its reproduction of modernity coloniality. This panel brings together leading figures in contemporary Latin American philosophy to consider what have been its principal contributions, what challenges or aporias remain. How is contemporary Latin American political thought in conversation with other cognate traditions such as African philosophy or feminism? That is the description of the panel. I will come back to one of the key sentences there. The description of the panel offers a distinction between, on the one hand, a concern, quote, about whether the region, that is Latin America, was merely copying or adopting philosophical ideas produced elsewhere in the 19th and 20th century, and on the other, the emergence of an end of the 20th century, and the emergence at the end of the 20th century of a decolonial perspective that challenged the continued Eurocentrism of much of the intellectual production in the region since independence and its reproduction of modernity coloniality. Right? That was the contrast between 19th century, 20th century philosophical formulations and the question about whether there was such a thing as Latin American philosophy, there was something original in it, and so on and so forth, to, on the other hand, a late 20th century phenomenon around decolonial theorizing, that somehow, at least the setup of the setup of the panel had was not equally concerned with the question about originality or disagreements about whether we're depending or not, but was rather thinking about or critiquing Eurocentrism in multiple ways, and modernity coloniality. That was not me, that was not anyone in the panel, that's the setup how we received it. So, this is what I want to say about it to start a discussion with this setup. That the first thing to note, I think, is that the critique of Eurocentrism that in the setup appears linked to that end of the 20th century decoloniality perspective is of course not new. There is much of this that is of the critique of Eurocentrism in the Latin American philosophical production of the 20th century. Perhaps one could distinguish between different critiques of Eurocentrism, though. For example, one could identify Latin American critiques of Eurocentrism and Eurocentric critiques of Eurocentrism, among others. The question is whether there is then a decolonial critique of Eurocentrism. But if so, we would have to describe it. So I would posit that a decolonial critique of Eurocentrism is one that does not presuppose the spatio-temporal framework of modernity. It would be a critique of Eurocentrism that would question categories such as Europe, understood as an isolated region or civilizational project, or categories such as Latin America itself, as an other of Europe defined in a similar continentalist frame as the other of Europe. That is, a decolonial critique of Eurocentrism would be post-Latin American, or just not Latin American strictly speaking. It won't be coming back to a particular spatio-temporal imaginary that has been already set up within the framework of modernity coloniality. Which, as you will see already, if this is so, then a decolonial critique of Eurocentrism will be out of place in Latin American Studies Association, because the Latin American Studies Association presupposes that framework, which is common to all area studies. That is, it would be a critique of Eurocentrism. This decolonial critique of Eurocentrism would be a critique of Eurocentrism that does not assume the special configuration of modernity or the expectation or of assimilation into the logic of development, which of course is one of the key themes of this event, that questioning of development. The rejection of the spatio-temporal framework of Western modernity would mean that the decolonial critique of Eurocentrism would not be recognized as an entirely legitimate project within the field of something like Latin American studies, what I just said before. It would mean that it is a form of critique that is not grounded on normative subjects who habitate normatively defined geographical regions, but that it expresses the skepticism towards the spatio-temporal configuration of Western modernity that one finds in subjects and communities that have been systematically excluded and rejected in the space-time of Western modernity. I will flesh out that a little more. I am referring to indigenous subjects, Afro-descendant communities, and border subjects everywhere. That is, subjects who habitate spaces and who tend to conceive of spatiality and temporality in different ways from this sort of modern colonial continentalist spatial framework. Because of this, reference to these subjects, these other subjects and these other spaces, border spaces and the like, a decolonial critique of Eurocentrism is not particularly interested in the question of whether Latin America as a region, to quote from the description in the panel, was merely copying or adopting philosophical ideas produced elsewhere. That is, it is less concerned with having to account for the specific existence of something like a Latin American philosophy. So the question about authenticity, originality, and so, that's not a main question from this perspective. Instead, a decolonial critique of Eurocentrism is more invested, or will be more invested, in contributing to the questions, ideas, and practices that emerge in processes of decolonization, including in processes that seek to decolonize the very idea of Latin America. And Walter Miñola has written a book on the idea of Latin America where he critically explores this dimension. That is why the goal of this form of critique of Eurocentrism takes as its object of critique not only European ideas and frameworks, but the entire arrangement of modernity coloniality, including the spatio-temporal coordinates that have led us to think about the world through continental divisions and through racialized geographies. In this light, then, if a decolonial critique of Eurocentrism involves a critical examination of the very presuppositions about space and time, out of which we make sense of our shared world, if this is so, then what would that mean? What would it mean then to participate in an event that features East-West relations? A decolonial critique of Eurocentrism would imply the need to explore the extent to which the categories of East and West are also part of modernity coloniality. If so, can we decolonize those spatio-temporal categories? And if so, how? I don't know about you, but these are the kinds of questions that will be in my mind when I listen to the rest of the presentations today and tomorrow. While a decolonial critique of Eurocentrism is perhaps most prominent since the last decade of the 20th century, it does not mean that it is unique to that period. However, at the same time, we can ask why is it that apparently a decolonial critique of Eurocentrism is particularly, or becomes particularly prominent then, starting at the end of the 20th century. I think that it has to do with various factors, one of which is the long durée of decolonization struggles. In particular, attempts at thinking conditions of dehumanization in relational terms, that is, in relation to various groups or regions of the world, typically led to a common denominator, colonialism. In that sense, the question of MSSR, what is fundamentally colonialism, as he spells it out in Discourse on Colonialism, imposed itself as a question to systematically dehumanize groups in modernity, increasingly so throughout the 20th century, as he was predicting in the middle of the 1950s. One could try to identify the different forms that this question took, as well as the different ways to respond to it. In the last quarter of the 20th century, traditional forms of segregation and colonialism were largely a thing of the past, at least juridically speaking. Yet the same brutal forms of dehumanization persisted. This led to new forms of strategies of survival and of critique, because now subjects who have been sort of colonized by the West, now the patterns of colonization and segregation do not seem to be justified by paper or by the law. The law has been suspended, supposedly now in their favor. So the struggle, that changes the terrain of the struggle, because the situation of exclusion keeps being the same. You need new tools to analyze how oppression is working in that context, and inequality. Now, one of these new forms of engaging the modern colonial world in that so-called post-colonial moment and so-called post-segregation moment, after the civil rights struggle in the United States gets some wings, for example. One of these formations was the women of color in the United States. And for them, colonialism, for the collective of women who call themselves women of color and doing a women of color feminism, for them, they continue developing the category of decolonization and the category of the decolonial, even as other groups of people of color invested more on the politics of recognition in face of nation states and the demand of more consistent expression of the recognition of their rights as citizens. Because if the law is not excluding you anymore, it seems that the job could be you convincing the state that you need to be appropriately represented by the law, and that will solve the problem. But at least this group of third world women of color was engaging not in the politics of recognition, but in the politics of decolonization. And they kept the grammar and the discourse of colonialism, new forms of colonization and decolonization throughout all the last part of the 20th century and towards the 21st century. So that's what I'm saying when I mean that this decolonial critique of Eurocentrism goes, is older than simply the last decade of the 20th century. It goes at least to that last quarter, but even that last quarter is part of an ongoing struggle from the civil rights movement and so on, and even from before. That is the long durée of the colonial struggle that I see. It's a long durée of conversations of artists, activists, intellectuals, scholars throughout the 19th, 20th century and arguably before, where they are sort of trafficking information about the knowledge about the structure of colonization and about how to resist and how to change. Right? And so you see that increasing conversation through codes in literature, music, essays, and so on and so forth. So that's the long durée of decolonization. So what I'm saying is that this decolonial critique of Eurocentrism became particularly explicit and prominent in context after the so-called when colonialism supposedly ends and when segregation supposedly ends. That it initiated, it sort of forced a new way of approaching critically Eurocentrism. And so this is one of the legs. I want to identify the three legs of this decolonial critique of Eurocentrism, and one would be this one. In addition to this dynamic in the last 25 years of the 20th century, and we could identify other groups in addition to women of color in the US that were also still sort of refining a critique of Western modernity in relation with colonization and decolonization. We found that closer to the last decade of the 20th century, the division of the world imposed after the Second World War came to an end with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Of course, the end of the Cold War division of the space was not total, and Cold War spatiality and politics still plays a role in defining East-West relations, among others. But at the same time, it became clear at the end of the Cold War, towards the end of the Cold War, that Marxist discourse, the traditional Marxist leftist orientist discourse, suffered a serious crisis of legitimacy. This crisis created a productive vacuum in the minds of leftist intellectuals, I think across the world, but particularly in Latin America, who were not as keen to defend Marxist orthodoxy and who were more open to take on other challenges and other questions, without necessarily trying to make them yet another effort to justify historical materialism. So this is the sort of second major socio-historical event that led to the explicit formation of what the presidential session at the Al-Asa characterized as a decolonial perspective. That is, in that vacuum, by the crisis of legitimacy of Marxism, opened a door for new forms of critique and theoretical elaborations. And that decolonial perspective, in a way, would have been more difficult to explode in the way that it has done if it was not because of that. But that's not the only thing that happened in that moment. There was a third. The third leg, what happened at the same time, which I think is linked to this and is crucial to understand the propagation of the decolonial critique of Eurocentrism, was the 500th anniversary of the discovery of the Americas in 1992. Since at least the 1980s, indigenous activists, artists, and intellectuals started to raise the question about the significance of the event, of the so-called 500th anniversary of the so-called discovery of the Americas. Simultaneous to that, multiple nation states in the Americas were preparing to participate in the celebrations. The academy could not escape the controversy between indigenous movements on the one hand and then nation states and celebrants of the event on the other. Dozens and dozens of volumes were published on the about the early days of colonialism and on the debate about the significance of the discovery itself. If you look at libraries between 1987 and 1993, there were dozens and dozens of books, journals, special issues dealing with the question about the significance and the meaning of the so-called discovery of the Americas. As the skepticism or disenchantment with traditional Marxism grew in the years approaching the end of the Cold War, scholars who could have otherwise continued to assert a Marxist perspective started to take on the challenges of trying to think about the long history of colonialism more seriously than they had done before. And that's the third element. So an example of this is Aníbal Quijano, a Peruvian sociologist, precisely was a long time committed to not orthodox, very original and refreshing, I think, Marxist perspective, but with the voices calling for the consideration about the meaning of the discovery and of colonization, he began to look at the 1492 about the meaning in the emergence of the world system, of the capitalist world system. And he began to use the notion of coloniality to refer to a pattern or matrix of power that defined the entire modern world. So these three elements, one, the status of the longue durée of decolonization toward the last quarter of the 20th century, two, the crisis of Marxism and the end of the Cold War in 1989, and the massive challenge by indigenous groups about the significance of the discovery of the New World, created the conditions of possibility for a self-conscious decolonial turn that is characterized by a decolonial critique of Eurocentrism in the form of a critical assessment of modern decoloniality and with attention to decolonization as an activity that gives birth to new ideas, symbols, and practices that challenge the modern colonial world. The concept of the decolonial turn was introduced in a conference that brought together Latin American philosophers and social theorists, Afro-Caribbean philosophers, and Latino philosophers and theoreticians. This was in 2005. I was the main organizer of the conference, and I introduced the term because coming from the area of philosophy, the notion of different philosophical turns was key to understanding different philosophical positions and movements. The linguistic turn, the pragmatic turn, the Copernican turn. At that time, I was simultaneously participating in discussions with the Modernity Coloniality Network and participating in a faculty seminar about critical theory led by Judith Butler and Martin Jay at the University of California, Berkeley. The goal of the faculty seminar was to define and design a corpus in critical theory that would serve as the basis and model for a graduate certificate on critical theory at the University of California, Berkeley. I was teaching there at the time. I invited my colleagues, the colleagues in the critical theory seminar, to the conference, which was called Mapping the Decolonial Turn. And while Judith Butler could not attend, Martin Jay served as one of the respondents in the conference. So what the concept of the decolonial turn made clear was that although the various main presenters in the conference, and I don't mean the respondents, Martin Jay, I mean the key presenters in the panels who were these figures from Latin America, the Caribbean, Latino intellectuals, and so on. The idea of the decolonial turn was that although each of these various presenters were in dialogue with different bodies of theoretical work, some were engaging in phenomenology, others Marxism, others post-structuralism, others post-positivism, and so on, one could not ignore the way in which their work expressed together a similar turn, a similar shift of orientation with respect to each of those bodies of work. That they were enacting a decolonial turn in relation to phenomenology or Marxism or post-structuralism and so on. Each in their own way performed a decolonial turn in relation to various bodies of work, Marxism, phenomenology, etc. It was clear then that the decolonial turn was not something unique to the Americas, or something that only characterized the work of late 20th and early 21st century scholars like the ones who were participating in the conference. The notion of mapping, in mapping the decolonial turn, was pointing to the task of looking everywhere for indications of decolonial critiques of Eurocentrism. The mapping was meant to be a remapping that sought to do what the Caribbean Philosophical Association refers to, following the expression of Lewis Gordon, as shifting the geography of reason. And then I thought that I would read a couple of paragraphs about what in 2005 we were thinking as the decolonial turn. Just to make clear that in no moment it was only a matter of a Latin Americanist turn, for example, or even an Americanist turn. But of course it included Latin America, the Caribbean, and so on. Scholars in the conference included Aníbal Quijano, Enrique Dussel, Silvia Winter, Maria Lugones, Linda Martin-Alcoff, Eduardo Mendieta, Sheila Sandoval, Luis Gordon, Paula Moya, Ramon Roscogel, who was co-organizer with me, along with Jose David Saldivar, also a co-organizer, and myself. The conference stood on two premises. And I am doing this because it's part of the theorizing of the decolonial turn. And this is from the introduction that I read in that moment in 2005. It's a couple of paragraphs. The conference stands on two premises, or rather, if you wish, seeks to put forward two fundamental theses. One, the first one is that just as there have been a linguistic and a pragmatic turn, there has also been a decolonial turn in critical thought. This turn was announced by W.B. Du Bois in the early 20th century and made explicit in a line that goes from Fanon and Enrique Dussel in the mid-20th century to Gloria Saldúa, Luis Gordon, Sheila Sandoval, and Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, among others at the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century. When W.E.B. Du Bois wrote that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, he was already enacting a decolonial turn. Du Bois was trying to see what was produced as invisible, and he was trying to look at the pathology of the world from the position of those regarded as most pathological and in some way non-human. The very enunciation of the problem of the color line, that's how Du Bois called it, was predicated on at least a partial solution, which involved a shift in the theoretical attitude of the knower. The theoretical attitude requires detachment and wonder. That is a very traditional conception of philosophical attitude that goes back to Aristotle. The decolonial attitude which Du Bois advances demands responsibility and the willingness to take many perspectives, particularly the perspectives and points of view of those whose very existence is questioned and produced as insignificant. The decolonial turn is about making visible the invisible and about analyzing the mechanisms that produce such invisibility or distorted visibility in light of a large stock of ideas that must necessarily include the critical reflections of the invisible peoples themselves. Indeed, one must recognize their intellectual production as thinking, not only as culture or ideology. Du Bois was implicitly suggesting all this when he asked the question, how does it feel to be a problem? But while much is talked about the idea that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the colonial, much less is discussed about his own response to the problems, which not only involve the creation of black institutions in the United States and Pan-African struggles, but also a fundamental shift of perspective that allows us to see the world and in a way that allows to target its evil, make it possible to target its evils in a different way, and that gives us a better sense of what to do next. These creation of black institutions in the US, Pan-African struggles, and so on, they are part of the long durée of decolonization to which I referred before. If the problem of the 20th century, and indeed the problem of modernity, is the problem of the colonial, which, as Lewis Gordon has argued, can be expanded to include the lines that are premised or produce dehumanization, the solution for the 20th century is, at least in part, a decolonial turn, that is a shift in orientation towards modernity itself. The decolonial turn marks the definite entry of enslaved and colonized subjectivities into the realm of thought at before unknown institutional levels. This is what we plan to further and deepen in this conference. The decolonial turn entered the Western Academy more centrally after the decolonization of many territories in Asia and Africa, the civil rights movement in the United States, and the movements that led to the creation of ethnic studies and women's studies programs in the United States, and similar movements in other countries which led to institutional recognitions of indigenous languages in different countries, such as New Zealand, for example. From the very beginning, these movements and the thought of the colonized as a whole tended to accentuate the problems of identity and liberation. The tension between identity and liberation is inherent to the struggle for decolonization, and it has a long trajectory of responses to it, as well as creative articulations that reject a fundamental divide between both, between identity and between liberation. That is, colonized subjects did not have to wait for the alleged tension between recognition and distribution to be raised in the context of a critique of so-called identity politics in the United States in order to know that one-sided political struggles are problematic and that certain forms of identity politics are perverse. So that is back from 2005. I'm closing that part. More recently, I have continued developing the notion. The notion has sort of spread. Many people are working with it. Notion of the decolonial term has indeed become this like sort of umbrella term to refer to similar efforts at engaging in the colonial critique of Eurocentrism in various parts of the world. And I've engaged not only in Latin America and the Caribbean and the US, but also more recently in South Africa for the last several years, where this dialogue is literally burning on the streets right now. More recently, I have defined the decolonial turn as a shift in attitude that takes colonialism as a fundamental problem. More recently, I have defined the decolonial turn as a shift in attitude that takes colonialism as a fundamental problem, instead of as this historical event that happened and that now in the past, and we overcome it. And B, the decolonial turn as a shift that considers decolonization as an unfinished project. The decolonial turn is therefore both project, unfinished project, and attitude. In this, I'm in a critical dialogue with the definitions of that Jürgen Habermas and Michel Foucault offer of modernity. To start, they focus on modernity or the Enlightenment particularly, not decolonization as such. And they regard modernity as either an unfinished project in the case of Habermas or as an attitude in the case of Foucault. Following Frantz Fanon's definition of sociogenesis as an approach that examines individual and collective attitudes in relation to social processes, I refer to decolonization as both an attitude and an unfinished project. So I think that Fanon, in a way, that he was approaching decolonization, he was already, in a way, advancing. 30 years before Foucault and Habermas begin to make these formulations about modernity itself. But Fanon was already making similar moves, but in relation not to modernity, but to the very process of decolonization. So, for example, in the case of Fanon, Black Skin, White Mask, his first book, is a study of attitudes of black colonial subjects living in a white normative and colonial world. The notion of attitudes appears prominently through the introduction throughout the entire text. It's a study of attitudes. And in The Wretched of the Earth, the last book, is all about the understanding of decolonization, not as simply the achievement of independence, but as an unfinished project. So between those two texts, I think they are, Fanon, in a way, work from beginning to end, was offering a prime example of the decolonial turn, understood as both attitude and project. That is part of the larger development that I have developed, I have presented elsewhere. That is one aspect of this theorizing of the decolonial turn. I'm sort of concluding now. I have also developed a genealogy of the decolonial turn, starting with the Haitian Revolution, and followed by the first wave of independences in Latin America, to the fall of Europe in the two world wars, the start of the Cold War, and the end of the Cold War and the celebration of the 500th anniversary of the discovery of the Americas. What I talked before, trying to explain this, making sense of the premise of the panel, referring to a decolonial critique that emerged in the last part of the 20th century, the explanation of that having three different legs, with the end of the Cold War, the 500-year anniversary of the so-called discovery of the Americas, and the long duty of colonialism, is part of that genealogy. It's sort of my effort at describing that last moment, the most recent moment of the decolonial turn. But there are others that you can even, at the end of the Second World War, the start of the Cold War is another moment, because it is the moment of second wave of decolonization in the 20th century, coinciding at the same time with the Second World War. But you can go back, and I go to the particular Haitian Revolution, not that it begins there, but that's where I try to anchor, at least the last part of the last 2 centuries. So theorizing the decolonial turn also involves reflection on the matrix of coloniality, including the coloniality and the coloniality of power, knowledge, and being. And this is the illustration that I have. This is just to show you some slides. There are a couple of it which are reproduced on the program for the conference. And this is also online. I uploaded it last year and on the website of the Frantz Fanon Foundation. And it's an outline of 10 theses on coloniality and decoloniality. Because one thing is the genealogy of the decolonial turn, looking at the different moments where that kind of critical consciousness seemed to reach new dimensions. Right? From 19th century, you can even go before to the 16th century, up to now. That's the work of doing the genealogy. But another work is doing the typology or the analytics of coloniality. That is, which are the main concepts and how they relate to each other. And 3 concepts that have been central in the theorizing of coloniality and decoloniality have been knowledge, power, and being. Of course, Foucault made very central in the Western Academy the linkage between knowledge and power. In modernity, coloniality, and decoloniality discourse usually engage also the category of being. So it has been that trio of main broad categories. Other people have talked also, and there is much conversation about coloniality of gender, coloniality of nature, and other categories of language and so on. But I take being, power, and knowledge to be probably the broadest categories, pointing to ontology, pointing to epistemology, and to the politics and ethics. So, and this is what I sort of offer in these 10 theses, that the illustration, the diagrams will hopefully give you more or less an idea of how, at least in my work, I've tried to relate them to the fountain of the day. The lights, hopefully some of you, you can see, it's not what is coloniality. It's a system that promotes, and this is like encapsulating exploitation, domination, expropriation, extermination, naturalization of death, torture, and rape. And I want to, in a way, connect this description of coloniality, of the effects of coloniality, with how the categories of, how they are anchored in conceptions of being, knowledge, and power. And so, I'm looking at being in relation to time, space, and subjectivity, because everything that is in space and time for the subject. Knowledge in terms of the subject, the object, and the method, and power in terms of structure, culture, and subjectivity. And this is following sort of a Fanonian understanding of being, power, and knowledge. This is not the only one, of course, that you can. But this is the framework with which I'm working. Also, when you can this here, you realize that subjectivity appears in the three elements. And subjectivity is like the node that sustains power, big, and knowledge. And so you have the subject is a common point in ontology, in politics, ethics, and in epistemology. So the way that I'm thinking of it is that these effects are anchored in power, knowledge, and being, which can be subdivided in a way in these forms, and the subject would be here. I don't know what the subject would be here, which then makes clear why Fanon, Lasky, why Mass, he's talking about the black subjects, about subjectivity is the site of interrogation of coloniality. It's not the only place where coloniality is shown, but it is that place where you see very clearly the intersection of knowledge, power, and being. So the black emerges as a black is made through the combination of the coloniality of knowledge, power, and being. And you are fixed there in the position of a black subject or regionalized subject. That's why liberation or emancipation is so difficult. That's why independence alone cannot be decolonization. And so when you look at it like that, another way of now putting the subject in that place at the intersection of these three forms of coloniality will be that the subject, and following Fanon, I'm referring to that subject as the damned. The Wretched of the Earth, the last book of Franz Fanon, is entitled Le Damné de la Terre. And I think there's something important about the category, because the category is linked with the notion of donner, which is to give. So, to be colonized, to be damned, is not to be in a possibility to enter the circle of giving, of connection, of interhuman relations, of giving and receiving. So, colonialism put this subject out of this circle altogether and produces very directly dehumanization. And so, but this dehumanization is sustained by discourses and structures that go from culture, social structure, and economic structures, conceptions about object and objectivity, method in the academy for how the European sciences also are complicit with the creation of that nation, conceptions and time and space. And that's why before, when I was talking about the critique of Eurocentrism, the decolonial critique of Eurocentrism, I was saying that it would have to be a critique of the spatial temporal framework of modern decoloniality, because coloniality is already embedded in our conception of space and time. The very notion of Latin America, of East and West, is part of this arrangement of space and time. Now, that is as relevant to being as is relevant to knowledge, and that's why they are all connected in a way. So power is connected with knowledge, knowledge is connected with being, and so on. And so when it comes to decoloniality, this is part, of course, of a much longer elaboration, and you find this is already posted open online if you'd like to explore it further. But the ultimate, so the last diagram incorporates both the coloniality and the decoloniality. That is the undoing of the colonial framework. And the undoing of the colonial framework then cannot be, of course, simply obtaining independence, or now dominating the nation state, for example, or now, for example, making just another Western university, or now controlling the Western university. It rather have to be multiple kinds of interventions, forms of creation and action that intervene, creating another sense of time, another sense of space, a radical critique of methodology and the suspension of methods for the production of knowledge, a critique of the notion of objectivity. Boaventura Sousa Santos does this quite well. And also thinking about other economic structures and political structures that can be then allow us to create this different sense of time and space, and of course another kind of cultural dynamics. So everything from cultural studies to geopolitical analysis, to epistemology, to art, and activism and spirituality have to be involved in what would be then a decolonial critique of Eurocentrism. And so that is what I will present to you as sort of a way of unpacking what is the decolonial turn, and what will this critique of Eurocentrism be that maybe is building from other forms of other critiques of Eurocentrism before, but also adding new directions and layers. Thank you.